Hello, hello, and welcome on Gelato. I'm here today with Lams from the Stargate team. Nice to have you on, Lams.
Thanks for having me on. Excited for this conversation.
Yeah, so how about you first sort of tell us what you've been up to in the last couple of years and where you're at today with Stargate? It seems like you guys are absolutely killing it. So excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So I'm Lams, the foundation lead over here at the Stargate Foundation. Our purpose is to support and serve the Stargate DAO and the Stargate protocol. I used to be with LayerZero a couple of years ago, where we were building out Stargate and we're core contributors to the protocol and kind of with the community and the DAO. And then as Stargate grew and kind of got its own life and its own relationships and business and really grew into its own as a protocol, I left and kind of moved over to Stargate Foundation, which was playing a larger role and have grown the team since. And so now, as I said, the Stargate Foundation plays a huge role kind of supporting the DAO, supporting the community and the token holders in the growth of the V2 protocol most recently, which was launched actually about a year ago, coming up on exactly 12 months of Stargate V2, which is what we've really been spending a lot of time on.
That's probably not coincidental that it was released around the same time that LayerZero V2 got released, or is it?
Yeah, it was. There were a lot of issues with Stargate V1, which maybe we'll get into, and a lot of that I think kind of fed into some learnings for LayerZero V2. And then obviously once LayerZero V2 was live, there was a lot of cool things that we could do with Stargate V2. So it was. Yeah, it's not a coincidence that they were kind of sequential. A lot of the unlocks around LayerZero V2 kind of fed into what was possible on Stargate V2.
Nice. So basically, I suppose a lot of listeners or all listeners will know LayerZero, and probably all of them will know Stargate. But I think in general in this space, it's not 100% clear what is the exact relationship and architecture. And some people know, and like you said, that Stargate sort of was, I guess, incubated inside of LayerZero as the first killer app built on top of LayerZero. And it has since spun out pretty much into its own thing, the Stargate Foundation, its own team, quite separated nowadays from LayerZero. And yeah, I think it's just like this is such an interesting story because it's so symbiotic, and it seems like you guys are building on top of each other's success, and it's like this mutually reinforcing symbiotic relationship that you have with LayerZero, where yeah, I mean we can dive into the tech, I guess. So Stargate is, I suppose I could call it a token bridging application, sort of liquidity management, whatever protocol that uses LayerZero underneath for cross-chain verification, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
I always frame it as like, LayerZero is the kind of the data passing layer, the infrastructure layer, allows message passing between different blockchains. Stargate is an application that leverages that technology to communicate between different blockchains. The information that we send from one chain to another is, for example, I'm a user, I have USDC, I've deposited into one pool, release 100 USDC on the next chain. So LayerZero allows for kind of any arbitrary messaging data. Stargate leverages that to pass data around specifically kind of token movement between different blockchains.
Yes, and I think I mean a common comparison would be Stargate versus something like a cross. And I think what makes Stargate pretty unique, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that we can unpack here, but first of all, it's this idea of unified pools. Roughly speaking, I think a cross has this sort of relayer model where users get filled from solvers that provide liquidity, and it's a bit sort of fragmented. The solvers compete to fill orders. Versus, I think one of the stark differences, and correct me if I'm wrong here, with Stargate is the idea is that all of the capital in the system gets pooled and can therefore be sort of even algorithmically, apparently with this AI module that you have, can be sort of rebalanced smartly across chain, and therefore, like technically, all of the capital could be used to also fill massive volume transfers, like single transfers, where any single solver might have an issue to fill that order, right? So is that sort of one of the key differences?
Yeah, there's a ton to unpack there, and I'd love to unpack a lot of it. But I think the TLDR is exactly right. Like many bridges in the space today have migrated over to a very different architecture to what Stargate is. Stargate has liquidity pools on different chains. Those liquidity pools, I think Stargate's TVL today is just over 500 million or 550 million, kind of down from 1.5 billion a couple months ago. And the liquidity within those pools is there to facilitate basically kind of matching of orders between different chains. So if we have $50 million of USDC in the Arbitrum pool, if you are looking to bridge from, for example, Optimism to Arbitrum, you deposit your USDC in the Optimism pool, and you can kind of release some USDC from the Arbitrum pool. And naturally, this leads to a lot of volume across a number of different chains. And as you pointed out, Stargate is the only liquidity pool-based bridge kind of still left in the space. It's a difficult architecture to maintain, difficult to maintain enough liquidity to make it scale to the number of chains that Stargate is on today. But it does mean that when you get it right, Stargate can facilitate huge transfers of size. And so, particularly during, for example, the Boyko bridging campaign for Bear Chain, we saw multiple transactions over $100 million using Stargate's tech. And actually during the kind of recent unlocks from Boyko, we saw that same in the reverse direction of, again, over $100 million being moved in size. So when the architecture is right, which I think we've kind of seen with Stargate V2 more recently, you can facilitate much larger transactions, and you can also kind of guarantee that they will actually be executed with intent-based systems and solvers. You need the solvers to have the liquidity in the right place at the right time, and they also need to think it's profitable enough for them to actually execute on the quote. Whereas with Stargate, because everything is kind of permissionless and on-chain, you know that if you can quote a trade or a swap, you can actually do it.
So simply speaking, the idea with Stargate is that all of the capital that enters the system is pooled, right? And what's important to understand here is if you ever use Stargate, let's say, to go from Ethereum to Base,
yep.
Now you essentially, I mean, it depends a bit, I suppose, on what token you get on Base. But essentially you have locked up tokens that are now in Stargate on Ethereum, technically forever, until you decide to give them out to another user that is coming into Ethereum, right? I suppose.
Exactly.
But your capital is now in the system, and of course, usually a corresponding amount of capital is leaving the system on Base, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Stargate has this concept of kind of global accounting. So exactly as you said, if you have 1 ETH on Ethereum and you want to go to Base, you can deposit the 1 ETH and receive 1 ETH. And obviously this protocol is kind of net, has the same amount of capital in it. You put in 1 ETH and you receive maybe slightly less because you paid a small fee. And so actually the protocol only ever has more and more liquidity within it as it's kind of accruing fees. And that becomes very important with the part of Stargate V2's architecture, which is Hydra and this kind of liquidity as a service module, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Exactly. Yes, I will get to Hydra, and of course, Hydra is like, I suppose, like part of the end game and part of this like massive structural advantage that Stargate has. But let's pretend Hydra doesn't exist for a moment. The sort of I guess liquidity operations by themselves. Do you guys have to work with liquidity providers, market makers, inject capital into the system, or can you like essentially, do you have enough upfront capital now to just rebalance the daily fills, roughly speaking?
So it comes from a couple different places. If we're pretending that Hydra doesn't exist, I can kind of talk about it, how it existed in Stargate V1. Obviously, Stargate V1 didn't have Hydra and is roughly similar to parts of Stargate V2. Initially, yes, Stargate needed to incentivize LPs. So a lot of the STG token was initially given to the Stargate DAO. The Stargate DAO incentivizes pools. So, you deposit USDC into a pool, you receive your LP token, put it into the farm, you receive incentives. And Stargate historically has paid out kind of very healthy incentives on these pools between kind of 4 to 8% on ETH and stablecoins over the past few years. Super simple, single-sided LP. We saw a lot of kind of sophisticated actors depositing funds in there just to make sure that they were still earning some yield, reliable yield on their assets. And simultaneously, the fees that Stargate as a DAO was accruing or accumulating protocol and liquidity. And so today, the Stargate DAO has about almost $100 million in USDC and ETH, which for the most part is deposited into Stargate's protocol in order to be kind of as self-sufficient as possible. And so if you say, for example, that Stargate, in order to operate most efficiently, needs maybe $200 million in the system, Stargate DAO itself can deposit almost $100 million, and therefore Stargate only needs to incentivize about $100 million of capital throughout the year, which does sound like a lot, but relative to kind of other systems that are operating on similar scales is actually far lower. And so, yeah, in isolation without Hydra, there is kind of a $100 million injection from the Stargate DAO, and then some amount of kind of incentivized capital using the STG token.
Cool. All right. So for tokens token routes in Stargate that aren't using Hydra tokens, the idea is still for these unified pools to have LPs in these pools, and essentially, how does the sort of pricing mechanism work? I think that's maybe another form of distinction that Stargate has. Like, how do you price a certain transfers based on how much liquidity they would remove in a pool? I think there's this mention of this AI rebalancing system that you have. So you're trying to sort of smartly incentivize certain routes, certain sort of liquidity rebalances across chains, fresh capital injection, and so on. So how does that roughly work? I guess that's the economics of trying to have a marketplace where you always have capital available as often as possible where it's needed to fill stuff, right? And you don't run out.
Exactly. So. Yeah, there's a lot of different inputs into it, but kind of broadly speaking, I think the first important thing, the concept of these unified pools goes back to like what bridging used to look like before Stargate existed. So if you imagine there's three chains, say Ethereum, Arbitrum, and Base. Historically, there was this concept of, if I want to bridge from Ethereum to Arbitrum, I need liquidity on Ethereum. But now if I want to bridge from Ethereum to Base, I need a separate liquidity pool, because this liquidity pool doesn't kind of know what transactions are originating from Arbitrum and Base. And so there's some sort of cross-chain latency, and the pools on Ethereum don't natively have, cross-chain knowledge. They don't know what transactions are on the way and which transaction might arrive first. And so there's some race condition where if you had a single pool, and this was built into some architectures before Stargate, if you had a single pool of liquidity and you had multiple transactions on the way, there's this race condition where some transactions would land on Ethereum, but there wasn't enough liquidity for those users. And so they would either get minted some kind of random wrapped asset, or they'd have to revert the transaction, send a transaction back, and it's just a terrible UX. So the kind of the innovation of the unified liquidity pool meant that, for users who are depositing liquidity, super simple. There's one pool, you add to that pool, that you can withdraw from that pool. But also what it introduced initially via the Delta algorithm for Stargate V1, and now using our planning module for Stargate V2, was this notion of guaranteed finality. And so every pool on Stargate knows the state of every other pool on Stargate. And so that kind of ties into this global accounting layer. Stargate, not many people know this, but Stargate is actually two different applications kind of built on top of each other, two different LayerZero messaging applications. So one is the kind of token messaging layer where these liquidity pools sit. And then there's an accounting layer, which is what we call the credit messaging layer, which ensures that at all points, every pool knows the state of all other pools. So when a user sends a transaction, for example, from Base to Arbitrum, it's not only saying, tokens have been inserted into one pool, release them from another pool. It's also bringing the accounting of this is the state of the Base pool. Please transfer that over to the Arbitrum pool so that it kind of knows the state. And so what that means is that users who, effectively it means that a user who initiates a Stargate transaction knows that if you're able to quote it, if you're able to submit your source chain transaction, by the time your transaction reaches the destination chain, that liquidity will have been available because it conducted the check on the source chain. And so that's kind of this complicated layer of accounting that not many people think about with Stargate and don't really need to think about. All they really need to know is that a source chain transaction works and will always be filled on the destination chain. And then tying that into the kind of the pricing of different transactions, which was your original question. It's important that Stargate is balanced and therefore can kind of fulfill these transactions across all these different chains. And so one of the big inputs into kind of how these how transactions are priced by the AI planning module is kind of historical volume and demand seen on different routes. So Stargate today is on over 50 chains, and you can probably predict what the kind of top 5 to 10 chains are. A lot of the largest L2s, and then obviously mainnet. And so what the planning module will do is ensure that the majority of the credits are available on the pathways that are historically the most busy, and also that the fees between those pathways are competitive, but also kind of help to facilitate the larger volumes that we see on those. And you can also imagine a state where, let's say Base is hosting some large incentives campaign, or for example, Unichain recently hosting a large incentives campaign. And so a lot of capital is wanting to flow into Unichain. And so, people are bridging from all the other L2s, for example, into Unichain. And the pools on Unichain may be getting depleted because, again, everyone is removing capital from those pools. What the planning module is able to do is obviously charge fees for the users who are bridging into Unichain, but also apply a reward for people who are willing to take the opposite route. And so if you are willing to take kind of the opposite route to the majority of the flow and therefore continue to top up Stargate's liquidity, then you'll be rewarded by the protocol for kind of helping to natively balance these pools. So kind of a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of information that needs to feed into what is the best way to price these transactions. And a lot of it is obviously to make a lot of it, the goal is to make sure that Stargate is competitive. The goal is to make sure that Stargate is able to handle and facilitate all the flow of kind of the desires of the users, and then also to make sure that the protocol can remain balanced.
Does it happen a lot, or how regular is it that I guess you mentioned that it shouldn't even be possible anymore to not get filled, because you wouldn't even be able to deposit on the source chain because there's a credit verification first, right? So it's but essentially, how often does the credit verification come back on the UI or on the API and is like, no, not available?
It varies. I mean, it's kind of funny. We especially recently have had quite large liquidity, and so we've seen some really, really large transactions going through Stargate. Like, again, with kind of some of these larger days like the Boyko campaign, we see quite a few kind of over $100 million transactions. But then once in a while we'll kind of get a ticket in our Discord, or someone will reach out and say, hey, I'm trying to bridge $20 million through Stargate, and it's not letting me. It says the limit is only $8 million. Like, how can this be? How can it be so low? And like, obviously, relative to a lot of the other systems, it's quite a large transaction. And so it's been interesting to see, like, now that Stargate is really facilitating a lot of 7-8 figure transactions, people are kind of expecting that this is just possible across all different chains. So we very rarely see that people will raise these issues, because typically on Stargate's front end, if you go to bridge $10 million, it'll tell you maybe the limit is 7 million, and then they can bridge 7 million. And each of these limits is a per transaction limit. So every couple of minutes, the kind of limit refills. And so it's highly likely that I think, a lot of the more sophisticated actors who are, for example, bridging $20 million might have to bridge in 2 transactions or 3 transactions.
Cool. And to go back to that credit system that you mentioned, I'm quite intrigued by it, because I actually happened to develop like a multi-chain, chain abstracted, async, whatever accounting batching system that we call One Balance, which I developed like 2 years ago, and we implemented it since then, like already like maybe 3 years ago. And I mean, for those for people that know Gelato does a lot of relaying across many chains. So this is not bridging per se, but it's actually often used by bridges, where essentially we are a relayer, similar to what LayerZero has as well. That is essentially, like, we have bots running on all these chains that essentially just make sure that if you deposited on the source, the funds get dispersed to you on the destination chain. We're not part of the security mechanism. That is usually LayerZero or something else, but we are just the transaction that actually does the withdrawal on the destination chain. So any bridge transaction you can think of, any bridge transfer you can think of as 2 transactions: you depositing and then someone withdrawing for you normally. This is the withdrawal part is usually an automated process, automated by someone called a relayer or executor. So and for this system, we, like, as soon as we were on 20, 30 EVM chains, we as soon as applications wanted to sponsor the withdrawal, like actually sponsor it, we didn't want them to deposit funds on 20 different chains to pay for gas. So we basically developed this one balance system where, as a developer, you deposit on one chain, you get an API key, and now we sort of, you can send transactions on all the chain, like 30 chains or so with Gelato's API, and you pay from a single balance. And it sounds almost like a bit similar to what you mentioned with the accounting system. Probably yours is way more complex. But is this like a sort of Merkle tree thing where you try to aggregate like all of the sort of pool credits across chains into like a root or something like this, and then you update that root? Like how is it actually guaranteed on chain? This is what I don't quite understand. Like, do you literally gossip all of the new signed roots like before you do a transfer? That seems crazy, right? Like
it's a little bit less complicated than that. It gets more complex. As I said, we're on over 50 chains at the moment, and so it does get quite complex, mostly from a mathematical perspective, but it's obviously all automated. But I think the simplest way, if I were just break it down into 3 chains, is to say, like, let's say Ethereum mainnet has a USDC pool with $1 million in it, and it's only connected to 2 chains. Let's say you can only bridge from Arbitrum, and you can only bridge from Base. And so if I have $1 million, I can say to Arbitrum, you can bridge 500K, and I can say to Base, you can bridge 500K in any one transaction. And that is kind of the credit layer. And so out of this $1 million, even though I have $1 million on Ethereum mainnet, in one transaction from Arbitrum, you can only ever take 500K. So that in theory, if you initiated from Arbitrum and Base at the same time, 500K, when they land on Ethereum, both of them have enough capital to withdraw from the pool. But if someone was on Base and they wanted to bridge 700K, and they saw the limit was only 500K, in theory, they could talk to Arbitrum and say, can I borrow 200K of your kind of credits or your limits, without Ethereum having to know anything about it. And so the planning module here would basically say, submit a transaction on Arbitrum saying, I'm going to take away 200K of credits to Ethereum, and just send a transaction to Base. And so there's only one transaction, and it goes from Arbitrum to Base to say, reduce Arbitrum's limit to 300K, increase Base's limit by 200K up to 700K. And so now the end state is that after a single cross-chain message from Arbitrum to Base, if you're on Arbitrum, you can bridge 300K. If you're on Base, you can now bridge 700K. And so again, in theory, if you initiated both at the same time, both transactions will still go through. And so what that looks like is that obviously when you first deploy the protocol, there's kind of a global state update of all transactions across all chains. But then as liquidity gets filled, so let's say now all of a sudden someone deposits $100 million into the Ethereum pool, and so now I have $101 million on mainnet. You can send out kind of a sprayed message from Ethereum to these other chains saying, I now have $100 million worth of credits. And so instead of only 500K from Arbitrum, you can now bridge $50 million and 500K, and the same to Base. And then, as I said, as kind of users send transactions or some of these limits get consumed, then the planning module will continue to send messages between different chains to kind of update this state.
All right, and it seems like, and I mean, we might go too granular here, but I'm very interested in this. So it's almost sounding like there's like a hub and spoke model where Ethereum in this example has like a special status. Is that actually the case, or is like every node, like if a user deposits into Base, like let's say in this example, a user deposits 1 million into Base and not into Ethereum, right? Like then this node.
Every chain, or in fact every pool, so every asset within a pool is kind of its own node. And so you can imagine if at any one point you wanted to get a snapshot of how did the credits look like for the Base USDC pool, you could this is all on chain. So you could query the Base USDC pool, and you could query the limit from Clayton or Berachain or something. And so every single pool is kind of a node in and of itself and has like credits and limits to all other chains. And so, as I said, Stargate is on over 50 chains today. Usually we deploy between 1 to 3 assets or 1 to 5 assets on every different chain. And so we have quite a complex system of kind of accounting and limits and credits across all of these different chains.
Yes, and I suppose the invariants in the system are you can never do fractional reserve banking, like you can never create credit out of thin air, right? And
exactly.
the other invariant that you're trying to optimize for is not to have a racing condition whereby you say a user, hey, you tell a transaction you have the credit is there, and then there's a racing condition and actually is not there.
Exactly.
Those are like the two invariants, right?
Yeah, it was quite a trade-off for us when we were designing it to even have like an off-chain entity. Stargate V1 was very strict in kind of being censorship resistant, permissionless, entirely on-chain, completely immutable. And with Stargate V2, we have all of those properties still. All contracts are completely immutable. But we needed to, one of the big learnings from Stargate V1 was that having all of that, similar accounting mechanisms used to exist in Stargate V1, but it was all on chain. So every transaction used to cycle through these algorithms to kind of calculate where to distribute these credits and should it be brought with it in the message. And it just meant that Stargate V1 was way too expensive compared to what users who are moving retail size want to see. And so moving that complex kind of algorithm and maths off chain meant that you could make the smart contracts incredibly simple. And that was kind of what necessitated this separation between the token messaging level and the credit messaging level. So it's very important to us that this planning module does nothing to do with tokens. It cannot touch the liquidity. It cannot remove from pools. It cannot do anything. It purely maintains the accounting. And it also cannot kind of create credits out of thin air. So you can't say like, oh, actually, there's a user who wants to, bridge $10 million. Let's just like create the credits to give them that limit. It is only just like moving credits from one pathway to another. And so it really is just like a simplification and bringing that kind of the complex maths off chain. But we were very strict around what it can actually do. And again, all of these, the transactions to remove and add credits all exist on chain. And so you can kind of, if you wanted to work through the contract tracing, you'd see that it can only remove and then add to a pathway kind of atomically on the source chain. And then it'll bring that information using LayerZero messaging as well, obviously over to the destination chain to kind of update that state as well.
Yeah. So the last piece in your great example there that I didn't quite understand, you had this interesting piece, or like, let's call it credit borrowing or something, where it's like, hey, we have 1 million on Ethereum. On this pathway, Arbitrum and Base are connected, meaning to avoid a racing condition, we can only allow 500 on Base and 500 on Arbitrum. And now Base can, like in this rebalancing credit system that you built, Base can quickly update this and say, hey, Arbitrum, please give me some credit. Now Base has 700 and Arbitrum has 300, right? The invariant is there. But you mentioned at this point, essentially, I think it is Arbitrum that initiates the cross-chain message, updates, like it says I'm removing 200 and giving 200 to Base, right? But wouldn't Ethereum also have to get a message to basically say you can now, Base can now bring in 700K or?
Not necessarily. It does necessitate a permissioned entity. Like this can't be a permissionless action, because then anyone could arbitrarily kind of move values between different chains. But all that matters to Ethereum is that I have $1 million of USDC, and nobody, the sum of all of the credits issued to other chains is not more than $1 million. So you can trade, Arbitrum and Base can kind of trade credits arbitrarily as long as they're trading one-to-one. Which again is kind of built into that credit messaging layer that they have to do that. But all that matters to me is that Arbitrum started with 500K, Base started with 500K, and as long as they're swapping one-to-one, like Arbitrum could in theory give all 500K of its credits to Base, so that the limit from Arbitrum is now 0, but the limit from Base is $1 million. But I know that always the sum of all credits from all chains to Ethereum is always exactly $1 million. So Ethereum doesn't actually have to have the state updated, as long as the other chains that are updating state are not maliciously doing so.
Yeah, I get why. I suppose because the information is already embedded, because at some point the $1 million was moving from Ethereum or from Ethereum to Arbitrum.
Yeah, exactly.
And this information is still encoded somehow. So it's actually
exactly. And the accounting is kind of guaranteed on source chain. And so again, if you started in the T0, there's 500K and 500K. So if you tried to do 700K before kind of sending that message from Arbitrum to Base, the transaction would revert on source chain because it knows, the base limit to Ethereum is only 500K. So because the kind of accounting state is actually maintained on source chain, which is quite like it's a bit of a mental flip that actually Base has more information about the liquidity available on Ethereum than Ethereum does
Yes.
about Base is a bit of a it seems backwards, but is actually makes for really good UX because you know that every transaction that is initiated on source is guaranteed to be filled on destination.
Yeah, it's that's such a genius system, and I guess the idea, roughly speaking, is that once capital enters the unified pool, the sum of this capital is split and shared as credits amongst every connecting node.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. So again, like if you imagine that a pool is a node, and so again we take Ethereum USDC in reality is connected to 47 chains, I think. And so if again someone tops up with $10 million of USDC, the planning module will see this. It'll see that the TVL is increased. It'll see that the pathways from Arbitrum, Berachain, and IOTA EVM are super low. Let's allocate that additional 10 million, 2 million to this pathway, 2 million to this pathway. We'll send kind of messages over to update those states. And then again, if Arbitrum consumes their whole credit, some whale is moving from Arbitrum to Ethereum, that pathway is now at 0. Again, it will see that pathway is now at 0. It'll see that these 10 other pathways are not being used, or the volume in the past 24 hours, whatever it is very low. Let's migrate the credits from these unused pathways over to the popular pathways to kind of beefing up those lanes. And all of this is happening kind of real time across all different pathways. Really quite an interesting system to follow, and it makes for a lot of really, really good data as well. Like we can see, again, when Unichain, for example, began their initiatives campaign, the amount of volume that flowed in and how the kind of accounting system was able to ensure that those pathways were as wide as possible to help Stargate capture as much flow as possible was really, really cool to see, and has been very successful over the past year.
Great. Yeah, I definitely saw Stargate and LayerZero popping like off on top of the charts recently on like DeFi Llama. If you look at bridges, volumes, and so on, it's crazy to see the dominance there. Does it make sense for me to now ask you and talk about Hydra, which is another huge? I mean, this one was already huge, but like Hydra is just as huge. I think the combination thereof.
Yeah, I think Hydra is it plays into this really, really well. So I think it's a good segue.
Yeah, so the way so what we just discussed was pretending that Hydra doesn't exist.
Yep.
And again, listeners, like I have an episode with Brian Pellegrino, the founder of LayerZero. If you scroll down on Spotify or wherever, you'll find it there from last year. And in there you can learn about LayerZero OFTs. I won't rehash all of that now, but the TLDR is what we just discussed was like essentially this credit system, this liquidity system that Stargate has built is to deal with tokens where Stargate is essentially not the issuer of the token. Exactly. What it means is Stargate does not have the printer button. Stargate can't just simply mint and burn tokens, and very common like mint and burn mechanisms that probably all of you have used is like Circle's USDC. If you use CCDP on like let's say a LeFi or whatnot, and sometimes you will see, oh, the route is CCDP. You will notice because it's like 50 minutes. It's a bit annoying, but yeah. So the idea is that for Circle has at some point decided to say, hey, we don't just want to have USDC on Ethereum and manage the balance there. Actually, we also want to bring USDC to Base and to Arbitrum and now to many other chains. And the way we will do this is we will have an off-chain attestation server, like we will do essentially the cross-chain messaging protocol. We won't have liquidity providers, market makers, or any of this. We don't need them because we are the asset issuer. So we're just deploying new ERC20s like bridged USDC or whatever they call it. And now our servers will essentially do the bookkeeping, which is the ideal position to be in for capital efficiency, because again, you don't need to worry about like rebalancing pools of liquidity smartly all the time for any sort of transaction with a mint and burn mechanism. you can simply, you burn the assets from the user on one side, you mint them on the other. And the reason this works for Circle's USDC CCP with CCDP is because they have decided that USDC should have this mint and burn button, and that they can control it. And of course, their version of USDC is the canonical one everywhere. There are no competing standards for this. Everybody wants to use the official Circle version, so they have all of the power there, right? With great power comes great responsibility. This model is, of course, a bit scary because sometimes, at least, because if they get hacked, it's pretty bad. But I guess at this point everybody is comfortable with it, because if Circle gets hacked, there's a lot of issues anyway, right? So yeah. But the cool thing is they're essentially using their own messaging protocol, which is in some ways quite comparable to LayerZero. Of course, LayerZero is way more fully fledged, has modularity, all of that fancy stuff. But essentially what Circle has is like a sort of purpose-built LayerZero just for their asset, sort of. And the cool thing with LayerZero is that there are these things that you probably have heard of, which are called OFTs, omni-chain fungible tokens. And it's essentially the same principle as saying, hey, if people are willing, if token issuers, developers, projects, whatever, are willing to deploy their ERC20s as LayerZero OFTs from the get-go, now LayerZero has God mode and can essentially move them across all of the chains freely. And we don't have all of this complexity that you have with Stargate for tokens that aren't OFTs. And now we get to Hydra. The way I understand Hydra is like, Hydra is using the LayerZero OFT model, but it's essentially bringing these OFTs into the Stargate system, where they can probably now compose, across many chains, between Hydra chains. So let's say you want to deploy a token and you want that token to be liquid on Stargate. Yes, and I suppose a cool thing here is like, it might not even be your own token. Let's say you want Tether or USDC on your chain, right? Like, this is an interesting use case for Hydra, but you also want to have people moving USDC into your chain from Solana and all of the chains, so you don't control USDC, right? That's the crux here. So now you can say, when you deploy your chain, you can say, or when you deploy your token, it's probably mostly like when you deploy your chain, like maybe on Gelato, who knows, right? And you say, I want USDC or Tether, and I want to have all of the liquidity and connections that Stargate provides me. Well, probably your best shot is to deploy that version of USDC not as a normal ERC20, but as a Hydra ERC20. Yeah. And now I guess you need to, there's a process where you need to convince the Stargate DAO to care about that. But once they do, your asset is now part of the Stargate system. And as a Hydra USDC, it can freely compose via this mint and burn with any other Hydra USDC in the system. Plus, I'm sure it also works in a hybrid way, where you can go from your Hydra chain USDC to a Solana USDC that you have pooled in the unified pool, right? And yeah.
So that's a super good setup for exactly why we had to build Hydra. So as you said, Circle's CCTP, or for that matter, LayerZero's OFT standard, is probably the best way to scalably move a token between chains across many, many different chains. And I think Athena's USDE is also a very, very good example here. So all of Athena's assets are issued as OFTs. I think USDE as a stable coin or global dollars is issued on 22 or 23 different chains with kind of Ethereum as a hub. And so if I hold USDE, I can take $100 billion of USDE and go from Ethereum to Mantle, and then I can go from Mantle to Bera, and I could go from I can go to any chain at unlimited size just for the price of gas. And that is like the real innovation behind mint and burn tokens. But like you said, USDC, for example, the only people, or the only entity, the only protocol with kind of mint and burn functionality on native Circle USDC is of course Circle. And that is great for the chains where Circle is deployed on. And so, as you said, you can use CCTP between Arbitrum and Base, or Arbitrum and Solana, and then $1 million per transaction. Again, you can move USDC for the price of gas. I think the problem that we ended up seeing, and this was actually the same problem that Stargate V1 tried to address, was that Circle is not on every chain. Circle will natively issue on the chains that make sense for them, or their commercial deals, or the ones that see flow, and also the ones where they can kind of scalably deploy their infrastructure to, because CCTP and Circle Mint and all of their infrastructure is not easy to deploy on the 100 different chains that we see pop up every week. And so what we wanted to do with Stargate V2 and specifically with Hydra was basically do this kind of bridging as a service. So if your chain is launching tomorrow and you don't have Circle deployed from day one, I think Circle have only deployed day one on maybe 1 or 2 chains before. You want to give your users the ability to have USDC on that chain day one. And so we can take Berachain as an example. I think has been kind of the most successful Stargate Hydra deployment so far. They wanted to have USDC available on Berachain day one. They wanted to be able to have USDC kind of backing their native Honey stablecoin. But as I said, Circle is not able to deploy their day one because it takes time. They need to kind of see the user demand, etc. And so what we will do as Stargate with Hydra is deploy the bridged USDC asset, which is kind of Circle compliant, if you want to call it that. That Circle have a repo that you can deploy out of, which means it is exactly the same ERC20 that Circle will deploy on other chains with all of the same setups, and the minter and the burner and the blacklister, all the same roles deployed out of that repo. And then we will basically extend that ERC20 as an OFT, as you said, so that the Stargate protocol is now delegated as a minter and burner of that USDC asset. And so this is the same across all Hydra chains that we're on today. So the USDC on Berachain, for example, today, the only place where you can mint and burn those assets is Stargate's OFT contract. And so the way that actually works for a user is if I have $100 of USDC on Ethereum and I want to go to Berachain, I, as before, will lock my 100 USDC on Ethereum into Stargate's pools. And then a LayerZero message will go from Ethereum over to Berachain to our OFT contract that says mint 100 USDC into this user's wallet. And so for the past kind of 30 minutes, we've been talking about kind of this lock and unlock feature with Stargate's pools, where again, we don't have the kind of mint and burn rights. But when you're going to a Hydra chain, it's actually a lock into a pool and then mint into the user's wallet. And then obviously in the reverse direction, you're burning from the user's wallet and then you're unlocking on Ethereum. And so what's super, super important is that if Circle wanted to one day take over that USDC contract, it is, again, deployed in a kind of compliant standard where Circle are able to take that over. We have a whole handover mechanism of handing this over to Circle. You're able to pause the bridging and then burn the underlying native USDC that's actually backing it. Once the handover is complete, that USDC asset is now Circle native. And you can use kind of Circle Mint on Berachain. And there's no changes to kind of the developers or the users. You don't have to do this kind of incentive mechanism to swap from a bridged version to a native version. It is just kind of a seamless compliant upgrade. And as you said, it is also composable across not only to the other chains where Circle is native, like Ethereum and Arbitrum and the ones we were talking about before, but also all other ecosystems that are using Stargate's Hydra. And so that is, Plume's Phoenix is launching in a couple weeks, I think, and it will be live on Plume, on Abstract, on Story, on Vana, Peak, etc. There are a lot of ecosystems that are now using Stargate Hydra as their kind of canonical bridging solution. And this extends to the bridged USDC asset, as we've been talking about, that we have a bridged USDT asset. And then the one that's maybe most interesting, as we've been saying, USDC, you're able to do kind of burn and mint features used with Circle. USDT and Tether now have USDT 0, which is kind of the omni-chain liquidity network for the Tether asset across new ecosystems. But you'll never be able to burn and mint ETH across different L2s, because obviously native, that can only happen on the canonical bridge for L2s and can't happen on Ethereum mainnet. And so Stargate is also extending kind of wrapped ETH as an OFT to a lot of these ecosystems. And so, for example, on Berachain, the wrapped ETH asset again is issued out of the Stargate protocol. You can bridge 100 ETH from Ethereum mainnet. It locks into Stargate's native pools. And then mint 100 wrapped ETH on Berachain. And then again, you can take this wrapped ETH to other ecosystems that are using Stargate's wrapped ETH, where you kind of burn and mint 100 wrapped ETH from Berachain to Story, and then you can still come back to Ethereum. The final, I think, the really big unlock, and something that I think that has been very successful for ecosystems like Berachain, is because Stargate has this global accounting mechanism. It really upgrades how powerful your canonical bridge is, because you don't have to only target users from one chain. So typically a canonical bridging relationship is, between the L1 and L2. So you can only bridge from Ethereum, you can only bridge to the L2. Or I guess you could kind of say, for example, Hyperliquid had this canonical bridge from Arbitrum, and you can only bridge USDC from Arbitrum into Hyperliquid. But with Stargate's Hydra, because we have this global accounting mechanism, you can now bridge from any of the chains that Stargate is connected to into Berachain, and so, or to any of the other Hydra chains. And so you can bridge, your 100 ETH from Ethereum into Berachain, do whatever you need to do, and then when you want to leave, you could bridge from Berachain to Arbitrum, and then you can go do whatever you need to do there. Or you can bridge from Base, but you can bridge an unlimited amount of size from any of Stargate's chains into any Hydra chain. And I think that is a huge unlock for ecosystems that are looking to bring users from all the different ecosystems, bring liquidity from all the different ecosystems. And Hydra is really the only mechanism that allows them to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I think there's like even another unlock here, if correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems, or it sounds like, so going between Hydra chains is like absolute God mode, right? Like we literally do just plain credit accounting again, but this time it's actionable in the actual token. There's no liquidity crunch. So if you go between Hydra USDC on Berachain to another Hydra enabled chain, which is another big one that I should
Story or Plume or
okay. So if you move USDC from Berachain to Story, you can essentially, like you have no liquidity issues. It's super low cost for Stargate. It's super efficient. Yep. It's great. But there's also another route where you go from a non-Hydra USDC version, let's say on Ethereum, to Berachain, right? Like you mentioned.
Yep.
But it seems like this is like such a win for Stargate, because normally if you deposit funds into capital into Ethereum and go to another chain, Stargate has to give you an equal amount roughly after fees on that other chain. So Stargate doesn't retain capital, maybe the fees, right? Stargate gets an incremental increase of capital in the fees. But here Stargate gets the whole like backing, the whole principle into the system on Ethereum. And that can now be used to rebalance across any non-Hydra chains, right? So is that effect actually happening? And
yeah, so like, that effect is happening in a really, really big way, and that was always the kind of end state for Hydra, because again with Stargate V1 there was a lot of incentives given out on the Stargate protocol, and Stargate still has a huge runway and can kind of facilitate these incentives for a long time, but it didn't feel very scalable. And Stargate was also accumulating, as I mentioned before, about $100 million in protocol and liquidity. But in order to really get to kind of sustainability, there needed to be a mechanism for Stargate to fill its pools without having to pay these incentives or kind of accumulate its own capital. And so, exactly as you say, and as really happened for the first time with the Boyko bridging campaign, when there was a lot of liquidity bridged into Berachain and locked for 90 days, all of the capital that gets bridged into Berachain gets minted into the user's wallets or into the vaults, but the underlying capital remains within Stargate's pools. And then, as we were discussing before, the kind of the accounting of that capital can then be used to facilitate kind of the netting of bridging between other chains. And so Stargate recently ran up to about $1.5 billion of TVL. That pretty much all of it was issued into Hydra chains, and the accounting kind of the credit layer of that $1.5 billion was able to be used to kind of facilitate the bridging of capital between these non-Hydra chains, between these pooled ecosystems. The most important thing to kind of remember is that, as you were pointing out, if you're bridging 1,000 USDC from a pool to another pool, there is only ever net more capital in the Stargate pools, because Stargate retains a small protocol fee. And so if you're bridging $1,000, you'll receive 999.9, for example. And so at any one point, all of the capital on Hydra chains is backed slightly more than 1-to-1. And so, as we saw with the Boyko unlocks last week, if there is some capital or a large amount of capital needing to kind of leave an ecosystem within a liquidity crunch, or maybe there's, God forbid, a hack on one of these chains, all of the capital is available to be bridged out at any one point, and is able to do so. It's just that while capital is locked into an ecosystem, the Stargate protocol can use that capital within its accounting to facilitate other kind of large transactions.
That's crazy. That's so cool. So actually, let's look at. I mean, by now everybody is probably pretty impressed already. I think probably we have enough on the tech now. I could ask about. I mean, let's quickly. I'm gonna ask this question, right? Like, for example, I know that Across's main pitch a year or two ago used to be, thanks to the optimistic model, we are the most gas efficient, ergo we win. But it seems like you guys are not super gas efficient with this this credit model. I know you have a taxi and a bus system, which is sort of like probably you can batch some of that stuff, but it's certainly not optimistic, right? So how come that, like, I mean, let me quickly pull up the chart here. I'm gonna use DeFi Llama as a source. I know people hate or love it, but yeah. So right now, this is the monthly volume of last month. And we got a LayerZero on top, like roughly 7 billion last month. That's crazy. Circle CCDP number 2. Not surprising, because I'm sure that Stargate, for some of their rebalancing, even uses CCDP, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of rebalancing that happens. I think also obviously centralized exchanges that are balancing between their books. CCP is a very good mechanism, as are OFTs, for kind of rebalancing across different routes.
Yeah. So and then we got, like, last month Stargate is number 3, right? And I'm probably, like, Stargate is even contributing some of that volume to Circle CCP here, right? So Stargate is really up there. And then we have Hyperliquid, like that's just the bridge from Arbitrum to Hyperliquid. I think I have no idea what's happening there. We got Wormhole, and then we got Across here, and then yeah, let's. I mean, we don't look further right now, yeah. So how come Stargate is like absolutely crushing it? Let's explain this a little bit. Is this mostly coming from things like USDT Zero? Is that part of Hydra? I don't know.
No, so USDT Zero is purely just an OFT and will feed into the LayerZero number. I think I just saw a tweet before this that USDT Zero just hit about $4 billion in bridged volume, 2 billion of that coming in the last week or two. And so really is taken off. I think we'll really rival, if not beat, the amount of volume that CCTP is doing across different chains, especially with the kind of expansion that USDT Zero is doing at the moment, which is amazing to see. Stargate is able to facilitate far more volume than any other architecture because of all of the things that we've spoken about today. So intent-based systems are naturally kind of hamstrung in how much volume they can facilitate, because they need third-party solvers who are profit maximizing or profit seeking to kind of deal with the opportunity cost of holding, naked ETH or naked USDC in their wallets, to be able to like quote these bridging transactions across different chains. And so, if you wanted to do $100 million transaction on something like Across, you would need a solver to hold $100 million on your destination chain and the specific destination chain that you're going to. And then, you give the protocol $100 million on your source chain, and they'll give it to you optimistically on the destination chain. And then it takes them 90 minutes. I think it's still 90 minutes on Across to actually get that $100 million back. And so just a system that isn't as capitally efficient as what something like Stargate is. So I think Stargate has seen a lot of success with larger transactions, is therefore able to kind of facilitate a lot more size. You'll see it at the top of the charts pretty much every single day. And the second, or I suppose the other part of it is, as you pointed out, I think the initial pitch around kind of intense-based bridging, not only from Across, from all of the kind of competitors who've moved into intense-based bridging, was that intents are faster and they're cheaper. And part of that was because they were very gas efficient. It's a very, very simple transaction when you're submitting an intense-based transaction. But as I kind of alluded to earlier, when we separated the credit messaging and the token messaging, contract layers, the Stargate transactions that you're submitting on chain when you're bridging are actually very, very simple as well, especially with the bus mode. And for users who don't know, Stargate has this kind of taxi and a bus mode. When you're taking a taxi, you are submitting your transaction and immediately a LayerZero message is sent to the other chain. And so you're submitting your source chain transaction, and you're also paying for the kind of gas abstraction of the LayerZero message. If you're taking a bus, it's obviously analogous to buying a bus ticket. So you submit your initial source chain transaction. There's then some amount of time where other passengers are buying bus tickets. and then this bus is driven as a batched LayerZero message over to the destination chain. And that really allowed us to reduce the kind of gas consumption of a typical Stargate transaction. And so the numbers actually worked out that a Stargate V2 bus transaction was 93% cheaper than an initial Stargate V1 transaction. And then obviously the protocol fee that Stargate is charging is also quite low. And so Stargate has definitely become the cheapest bridge that's available out there. And certainly when Stargate V2 launched. And then the other thing that we're also seeing now is the latency of a Stargate transaction depends on kind of this LayerZero messaging portion. And as finality is approving across different chains, that latency is dropping quite significantly. And so we will very, very regularly see Stargate transactions that are executing at any size between two chains, kind of below 10 seconds, below 7 seconds even. And so Stargate is definitely getting faster as well. And so I think the Stargate always had quite a large market share within the bridging space, but in the areas that it was potentially lacking before, where it maybe wasn't as cheap or wasn't as fast, is actually catching up as well.
Yeah, and in general, I've always been of the opinion, maybe a bit too early, that gas fees should go to zero anyways. And I mean, so the trend of many chains launching cheap chains, right, is also in your favor because gas is less of an issue on these newer chains, right? And even the rollups that were still expensive 2 years ago and so on are getting cheaper with various optimizations they're doing, and Ethereum itself also becoming like proto-dank sharding and so on reduce costs as well, right? So overall, like there should be a growing trend where gas costs are going nearing zero at some point on most chains, right? So and I just realized as well. So the issue with the optimistic model is that the solver has to part with their funds to wait for the challenge window to pass. Whereas on Stargate, liquidity providers immediately have new capital to use, right?
Yeah, exactly. As soon as a Stargate source transaction is submitted, that capital can be used to fulfill another destination transaction. And so Stargate is, I think people used to say that the liquidity-based model is very capital inefficient. I actually think Stargate has proven itself to be incredibly capital efficient, facilitates a very significant amount of volume with very, very little spent on incentives. In the past 4 months, Stargate has spent probably 1/20th of maybe what something like a cross has spent on incentivizing LPs, and yet is able to facilitate more kind of volume. And so I think it is probably difficult to scale liquidity pool-based system to the size that Stargate is today, but Stargate has been able to do it and therefore kind of benefit from the success it has seen.
Yeah, and liquidity is like the only mode, right? Sort of. And I think, I mean, it's a unique story that you have where LayerZero also just plays a crucial part in being like an accepted messaging system for stuff like Hydra, where that people know and trust, right? And are willing to, I mean, so many teams that approach us on Gelato, rollup as a service, they're all essentially already want to deploy their tokens as OFTs, right? I think the LayerZero OFT standard plays a big role in this success as well, because exchanges like it. Apparently, word on the street is that one of the reasons to deploy as an OFT is because Binance knows it, and then the chance of you getting listed is slightly higher than without it, or something like that.
Yeah, I think LayerZero and Stargate have obviously played into each other's successes. The number one thing with bridging is always security, right? Like the number of bridge hacks that we've seen, you always want the bridge that you're using to be secure. You want your funds to actually arrive on destination chains. Stargate has never lost a single dollar in LP value, has never been hacked, has completely immutable smart contracts as well. So kind of as Stargate continues to be successful and TVL grows, you know that the smart contracts are hopefully secure, very heavily audited. But as you're saying, I think a lot of chains that maybe want to have kind of LayerZero deployed to their chain want to do so because they want to be able to access the liquidity of all other chains. And so I think we kind of see the conversation go in both directions, where a new chain that's launching really wants Stargate to deploy, and obviously us being built on top of LayerZero, we need the LayerZero endpoint to be deployed first. And similarly, conversations that may start over with LayerZero, they also want Stargate to deploy. So I think Stargate was the obviously the first application built on LayerZero, but still is the largest and still does kind of the quite a lot of LayerZero's messages on a daily basis.
Cool, nice. Yeah, so we saw that LayerZero is still number one in terms of volumes. Is that DeFi Llama like data? Does that include some of? Is that sort of a clean separation, or is that mostly coming from Tether being right now a LayerZero OFT? Like, or is your goal to be number one at some point with Stargate? Is that happening?
The goal is always to be number one with Stargate, but I think like it's been really incredible to see the success of the OFT standard. Tether using USDT Zero as kind of an expansion mechanism across new ecosystems. Athena also had some incredible success. Some of ETHFI's assets having huge market caps. WBTC being an OFT. Like there are some really large assets that are moving as OFTs. And the cool thing for Stargate is, we've spent a lot of time today focusing on kind of the Stargate V2 protocol and the kind of inner workings of that. But Stargate really is also just kind of a retail facing front end, or like the Stargate product, which has, we also have CCTP on our front end. But I think crucially, Stargate, we call it kind of the home of all OFTs, because a lot of the OFT issuers or asset issuers just use Stargate as their front end. And so, you can bridge all of the OFTs that we're talking about, USDT Zero, WBTC, USDE, PayPal USD, all of these assets are OFTs and available on Stargate's front end. And so a lot of the LayerZero numbers that kind of come from OFT volume or OFT flow, even though they don't get counted into Stargate's protocol numbers, are actually coming from Stargate's front end as well. So I think, Stargate as a protocol maybe did $2 or $3 billion of volume last month, but I think Stargate's front end probably did about $6 billion.
Wow, cool. And it's almost like you guys are some sort of Stripe for coins. Is that like an apt analogy, or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about Stargate as a kind of Stripe for coins, especially with as we say, like there's a lot of asset issuers that are looking to ensure that they are on different chains for day one, and so Stargate kind of being able to, at least in my head, be able to contribute to the kind of success and growth of USDC and USDT across these new ecosystems. Again, if Stargate didn't exist, it would be a lot more complicated to get day one USDC liquidity onto a new chain. But Stargate has issued a bridged USDC asset to over 30 chains now, and I think from Circle's perspective, kind of they're able to see which of those ecosystems get a lot of adoption around USDC and how they can kind of continue growing even in these new ecosystems. So I think we play a very important role in kind of facilitating the growth of these new ecosystems from the chain perspective, but then from the asset issuer perspective, also play a very important role in ensuring that they're still available on these new chains day one, and in a kind of secure way, in a compliant way, and in a way that offers a good user experience.
Cool, nice. All right, so slowly wrapping up. I'm absolutely like pilled and absolutely excited. Like I definitely learned a ton. I was really looking forward to, because I think I talked to so many people in the bridging and interop space. I talk a lot with the LayerZero team. I talk a lot with the Hyperlane team. I talk with Across like a year ago, and with Hard a couple of times, and others like back in the day, Stellar, Seabridge, multi-chain. Like I've been exposed to this for quite some time, but I never talked to Stargate directly, only via LayerZero people, right? Yeah. So it's been great to have you on and hear it from the horse's mouth, as the saying goes. So I mean, what can we expect for Stargate V3? Like, what does V3 even mean? Is it just expansion and growth for you now? Is there a fee switch?
So for us, I mean, I think, as I said, over the past year, we've really focused on growing Stargate V2, which is somehow almost a year old now, but really focused on ensuring that Hydra has been successful, launched on over 30 chains, and we continue to expand Hydra to different ecosystems. But I think what's important for Stargate kind of going forward is kind of capitalizing on the success of itself. And so you'll see a lot of proposals within the Stargate DAO at the moment to really kind of hone in on some of the successful Hydra ecosystems, and for Stargate to play a kind of bigger role in those ecosystems, either from the treasury standpoint, or kind of working with a lot of the protocols to enable some of their kind of omni-chain native functionality. And then also just building on the kind of products that we offer to users. And so, as I said, we recently added CCTP because we wanted to be able to unlock native USDC on Aptos and native USDC on Solana, where the Stargate protocol isn't natively deployed. And so really just building on the fact that Stargate has a trusted name and brand and a good product that people want to use.
Cool. And I'm just throwing my head into the ring for some crazy ideas, but so you're connecting all of the tokens on all of the chains, but I've worked with Monerium like 2 years ago. They were also using Gelato, or Gnosis Pay was using Gelato relaying. And this way I got to learn that Monerium, this Euro stablecoin project, actually they're sort of slept on a little bit. They actually built such cool tech. It's probably the European EU is bad for business curse or something, why they're not more known. But essentially they built this cool thing where you get you have like a safe, I think it is like a safe address, and it's somehow connected to a bank account, and they are like fully regulated in the EU. And essentially TLDR is you can send money to that address, and then that like euro to that address, and that euro on chain will then appear in your bank account, which is crazy, right? And I think it works the other way around as well. So this is like there's some connection here between on-chain money transfers and off-chain money transfers. And of course, there's been projects like ZK-TLS, I think that might be up there and so on. So I don't know where on the roadmap, but potentially at some point, Stargate has flows that span and go beyond just chain flows, and maybe you have who knows, like bank transfer flows as well, or something like that. Do you think?
I think we have some super powerful infrastructure. Like obviously, goal is eventually to bring a lot of those kind of legacy financial instruments on chain, or a lot of the legacy money movements on chain. But the infrastructure that we're building, both as I said, kind of on the front end or product perspective, but also at the kind of API level, to facilitate the movement. Really, the goal is any token, any chain. And be able to facilitate that movement, as you say, kind of from off-chain into some of the maybe the on-rampers or more traditional systems, I think is a very natural evolution for Stargate. And I think is hopefully the direction that the industry is trending in as well, because that's when we'll hopefully have some really cool unlocks.
Yeah, because if we're probably all fans of hyper tokenization here. There's a shit ton happening right now. I mean, Ethena, you mentioned, right? They're doing crazy stuff or planning to do crazy stuff. So the way to look at it is probably all of the money that is not on chain, not tokenized yet, is just sitting on the sidelines waiting to become tokenized, right? So if you can reach out there, you don't just help people to move their money from Ethereum to Berachain anymore, the ETH, right? Like you can help them, move their euros from Revolut to ETH on Berachain at some point, or euros on whatever, right? Like that would be crazy.
Exactly. Making that experience easier. And I know maybe the narrative doesn't get spoken about as much, but the goal of chain abstraction, asset abstraction, making all of that process a lot easier, I think Stargate has a very big role to play in that.
Yes, and right now you're basically working on, because of blockchain infrastructure, most of all, and things like LayerZero, right, that are essentially using blockchain infrastructure as well to verify signatures or whatever it is, or at some point ZK stuff, but yeah, like potentially with new things like ZK-TLS also, you can use these other cryptographic commitment schemes or whatever it is, like primitives to suddenly unlock a whole new world of I mean, what do blockchains do? They commit their commitment engines, right? And based on these commitments, these credit commitments or whatever, like we can move money around. So they're great for that, but maybe, who knows, maybe ZK-TLS or something like that can also go to, or even this LayerZero V apps. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I'm not going to open that Pandora's box now, but yeah, let's end it here.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Yes, exactly. I should look it up. But yeah, super nice to meet you, Lambs. That was great. Thanks for sharing all of your alpha and information with us. And yeah, that one was one for the ages for sure. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on. I've done a couple podcasts talking about Stargate V2, but never really gotten into the technicals of how the credits and the token messaging work. So it's been really fun. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I think like as a podcast host, I'm a bit unique because I really, I'm quite technical and go really deep on this stuff. So normally I think that's not the case. A podcast host normally wouldn't have the time to go so deep.
Yeah.
It's like my daily job at Gelato is to work and understand with these systems, understand these systems, right? So this is why I do the On Gelato pod. Is like obviously there's no ads here, right? Like I just sometimes meet people. I'm like, hey, let's have a chat, right? That's basically it.
That's awesome. We need more of that in the space.
Thanks a lot.